Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something pretty heavy, but fascinating. It's all about how war has shaped humanity.
Yeah. And I mean, shaped us not just in the history books, but literally like in our evolution.
Okay, so we're going deep. What's our source material for this?
Our main source is actually this book from over a century ago, War and the Breed. It was published right in the middle of World War One.
Wow, talk about being in the thick of it. Who wrote this?
The author was a guy named David Starr Jordan. He was a prominent scientist,
Okay.
actually an ichthyologist, believe it or not.
An ichthyologist, huh? So like a fish expert writing about war. That's an interesting combo.
Yeah, but he was also a really big peace advocate, so it makes sense that he'd be thinking about these connections.
So a century later, why are we diving into this book? What makes it so special?
Well, Jordan doesn't just talk about like the battles and the generals and all that. He goes deeper.
Hmm.
He's looking at how war impacts the very building blocks of who we are, almost like on a genetic level.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does he even approach that?
So he starts by laying out these four factors of organic evolution. They're variation, heredity, selection, and then segregation. And then he applies them to humans. He's basically saying we're not exempt from these forces just because we're, humans.
So, like, Darwin meets the battlefield. Okay, break it down for me a little. How do these factors actually work in the context of war?
Okay, so variation just means that we're all different. Like we have different traits, different abilities, that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. We're not all clones. What about heredity?
That's just, the idea that we inherit traits from our parents, the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Right. So far, so good. But how does war even fit into this? I mean, we're not out there fighting based on who has the best genes for camouflage or something,
Yeah.
right?
That's where the selection part comes in. So in nature, the idea is that the individuals who are best adapted to their environment, they're the ones who are more likely to survive and have offspring.
Natural selection, right?
Got it. Survival of the fittest. Exactly. But Jordan argues that war actually messes with this whole process. He calls it reversed selection.
Reversed selection. Okay, now you have to explain that one. How does war reverse natural selection?
Well, think about it. When a country goes to war, who do they send to fight?
The strongest, bravest, most capable young men, I'd imagine.
Exactly. The ones who are considered the most fit. But here's the thing. Those very qualities that make them great soldiers, the courage, the strength, the willingness to take risks, those are also the qualities that make them more likely to die in battle.
Oh, wow, I see what you mean. So they're the ones who are less likely to survive and pass on their genes.
Yeah, and meanwhile, back home, the folks who maybe were considered fit for service, they're the ones who are left to have families and pass on their traits.
So it's like the very act of choosing your best fighters could be weakening the overall gene pool over time.
That's Jordan's argument, and he uses a bunch of historical examples to back it up.
Oh, like what? Give me an example.
Take, for example, the fall of Rome. Lots of historians will point to things like luxury or decadence as the cause of their decline.
Right. It got too soft.
Well, Jordan says no. He thinks it was more about the constant loss of their strongest men in battle.
So all those gladiators and legions, that wasn't actually making them stronger in the long run. It was weakening them.
That's what Jordan argues. And to really drive home the point, he talks about how the word homo, which is like the common man, replaced the word vir, which means like the virile man or the strong man.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. So he's saying Roman society literally shifted away from his warrior ideal.
Exactly.
And he makes a similar argument about ancient Greece, right? Like all those epic battles ultimately weakened them from the inside out.
Exactly. All that fighting took a toll. And then he brings up this other example that I found really interesting. Samarkand.
Samarkand. Okay.
Yeah.
Remind me, where's that?
It was this really important center of learning, like an intellectual powerhouse. But it was ravaged by conquest after conquest. And of course, who dies in those conquests? The strongest.
Right. So it's like war doesn't just destroy cities and economies.
Mm.
It can extinguish the very spark of a civilization.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just ancient history. Jordan also talks about France.
What about France?
Well, he noticed that after the Napoleonic Wars, the average height of Frenchmen actually decreased.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And he attributed this to, you guessed it, the loss of those robust genes during all those years of fighting.
Hmm. So even in more recent history, we see this potential impact of war on the physical characteristics of a nation.
It makes you think, doesn't it? But Jordan also points out that France did eventually recover, showing that given peace and time, those natural forces of selection can, kick back in and help a nation bounce back.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's hope for recovery.
There is. But then he shares this really poignant observation about Scotland, specifically the Scottish Highlanders.
The guys in the kilts, what about them?
Well, Jordan actually personally witnessed a decline in their stature, and once again, he linked this to generations of their strongest men being recruited into the British Army.
Leaving a, shall we say, less impressive gene pool behind?
Yeah, something like that.
It's like, even within a powerful empire, certain groups can bear a disproportionate burden of this reversed selection pressure.
Exactly. And that's precisely where Jordan takes us next. It's a really fascinating part of the book.
Buckle up, listeners. Sounds like we're about to uncover some uncomfortable truths about how power and war intertwine.
Let's just say Jordan pulls no punches when it comes to exposing the biological price tag of imperial ambitions.
We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Okay, so spill the tea. What are these hidden costs Jordan's talking about?
Well, he points to those bronze plaques you often see in English churches, commemorating the young lives lost in wars, often in far-off corners of the empire. Jordan saw those plaques not just as memorials, but as stark reminders of this biological cost, a nation sacrificing its best and brightest for the sake of conquest.
He actually uses a really striking phrase to describe those who died in World War I. He calls them the picked 500,000. He's talking about the university men of Britain, the intellectual elite, the ones who were sent off to the trenches.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering when you think about it that way. All that potential just gone. But, I gotta ask, doesn't war also bring out some of the best in us? What about courage, sacrifice, all that? Don't those qualities kind of flourish in times of conflict?
It's true. We do see incredible acts of heroism and selflessness in war. How does Jordan address that? Is he saying there's no positive outcome from war?
Well, he doesn't say nothing good comes from it, but he argues that war doesn't actually create those virtues. It just, it kind of reveals them and then a lot of times consumes them.
So it's not that war makes people brave. It's that brave people are drawn to war, and then, well, they're the ones who end up in harm's way.
Exactly. And that goes for other qualities too, like sacrifice, leadership, resilience. They exist in a society whether there's a war or not. But war kind of forces them to the surface and then demands them, often to the point of exhaustion.
It's almost like burning a candle at both ends. You might get a brighter flame for a while, but you'll burn out a lot faster.
That's a great analogy, and it makes you rethink this whole idea that war builds character, But what about modern warfare? It's not like it used to be, right? It's more about technology now, less hand-to-hand combat.
Good point. Does that change things? If war isn't specifically targeting the fittest, does that mean Jordan's theory is kind of outdated?
It's a good question, for sure. I mean, a drone strike doesn't care if you're the strongest guy in the village, right? But even with all the technology, there's still this massive loss of life, and it's often concentrated among, young people who would otherwise be contributing to their society's future.
So it's like, regardless of the weapon, you're still removing individuals from the gene pool, and that messes with those natural processes of selection that Jordan was talking about.
Exactly. And it's not just about the immediate loss either. You have to think about who's left to rebuild, who's passing on their genes, who's shaping the culture and values of the future.
Sobering stuff. It makes you realize that even with all our technological advances, we're still not immune to these fundamental forces of evolution. And war's still exerting its influence, even if it's in ways we don't fully understand.
It really makes you think. But despite all this darkness he was writing about, Jordan wasn't completely pessimistic about humanity's future.
Oh, that's a relief. Because to be honest, this is all getting a bit heavy for me.
Well, he believed that, along with those primal warlike instincts, humans also have a capacity for peace and cooperation. And even in the midst of war, you see glimpses of this, right? Acts of compassion, efforts to rebuild, that kind of thing.
So it's not a question of whether we're a warlike species or a peaceful one. It's more about which instincts we choose to nurture.
Right. Which path we choose. And Jordan believed that, Overall, humanity was slowly moving in the direction of peace. He even pointed to specific people throughout history. He called them visionaries and peace workers, people who challenged the status quo, people who dared to dream of a world without war.
And work to make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. And he believed that their efforts, even when they were ridiculed or ignored, would ultimately have a huge impact on the course of history.
That's kind of beautiful, actually. It's like a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope, and that even our small acts of peacemaking can make a difference in the long run.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this book so relevant even today. It's not just about analyzing the past, it's about inspiring us to act to create a better future.
So, what are some of the key takeaways that you think our listeners can apply to their own lives?
Well, I think the biggest one is just to be aware, be aware of the costs of war. Not just the obvious stuff like casualties and destruction, but the deeper long-term impact on who we are as humans.
On our societies, our values, even our biology.
Exactly. And I think it also challenges us to question this whole idea that war is somehow necessary for progress or that it makes us stronger. Because, Jordan's argument is that true strength comes from peace, from cooperation.
It's about nurturing the things that help us thrive, not just survive.
Exactly. And recognizing that peace is a choice. It's something we have to actively work towards.
And maybe even asking ourselves, how can we be those visionaries and peace workers that Jordan talked about? How can we contribute to a more peaceful world?
It's a great question. It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, I think.
It's easy to get kind of overwhelmed by all this, right? Like peace is this huge abstract thing.
Yeah, it can feel that way.
But Jordan seems to be saying it's not just about like signing treaties and big political stuff.
He really emphasizes that it starts with us, with our individual choices and actions.
Okay, so what does that actually look like? I mean, I'm not out there negotiating peace deals in my daily life.
Think about it like a ripple effect. Every act of kindness, every time you try to understand someone who's different from you, every time you choose to talk things out instead of, getting into a fight, you're contributing to a more peaceful environment.
So it's not about those big dramatic gestures. It's about the everyday stuff.
Exactly. Those little choices we make, they add up over time.
It's like, what's that saying? Be the change you wish to see in the world.
Exactly. You become the ripple, and you never know who you might inspire.
That's a good way to think about it. It makes peace feel a lot more attainable.
And one thing that really struck me about Jordan is that he was writing all this during World War One. I mean, can you imagine trying to hold on to hope for a peaceful future while all that's going on around you?
It's incredible, really. It shows how much he believed in humanity's potential, even when things were, pretty bleak.
And I think that's a message we need to hear today, too. Maybe we're not in the middle of a world war, but there's still plenty of conflict and division out there.
So what's the takeaway for us, for those of us listening, trying to make sense of it all?
It's a call to action, I think, a call to be more intentional about choosing peace in our own lives, in our communities, everywhere.
And a reminder that even though it might be hard, even though it might take time, peace is something worth fighting for.
It's definitely worth the effort.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into War and the Breed. Hopefully it's given you some things to think about, maybe some inspiration to act, and maybe even a little bit of hope for the future.
If you're curious to learn more, definitely check out the book. It's surprisingly readable, and I think you'll find Jordan's ideas are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Who knows? Maybe you'll be inspired to become one of those visionaries or peace workers that Jordan talked about.
It's been great diving deep with you all today.
Until next time, keep those minds curious, those hearts open. And remember, even small ripples can create big waves.